A Michael J. Fox movie made $110 million and nobody alive remembers it. A Sean Connery Bond film made $160 million, and it's not even considered canon. The 80s made so much money at the box office that entire blockbusters just disappeared. Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor made a prison comedy in 1980. They played two friends who get wrongfully convicted and have to adjust to life in jail. This was their second movie together after Silver Streak, and the studio was banking on their chemistry to sell tickets. It worked. Stir Crazy made over $100 million at the box office and finished as the third highest-grossing movie of 1980. And this wasn't some fluke. Comedies were dominating the 80s in a way that just doesn't happen anymore. A bleak prison comedy with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor making jokes about jail was pulling numbers that would make studio executives weep with joy today. But Stir Crazy faded. The humor got dated, the premise got old, and nobody really talks about it anymore. It's not considered one of the iconic 80s comedies, even though it outgrossed most of them. The next year, there was a movie about a drunk rich guy who gets cut off from his family fortune. It's because he wants to marry for love instead of marrying who they tell him to. Dudley Moore played the lead, and the whole thing cost $7 million to make. It made $95 million at the box office. Arthur finished fourth for the entire year, and when you look at what it was competing against, this $7 million comedy about an alcoholic playboy was punching way above its weight. It was one of the cheapest movies in the top 10 that year, and it still managed to land in fourth place. Of course, they made a sequel. It bombed at the box office. They made a remake with Russell Brand in 2011. That bombed too. Paul Newman played a washed-up alcoholic lawyer in 1982. The character takes a medical malpractice case to try to rebuild his reputation and get his life back together. The movie cost $16 million to make. It made over $50 million at the box office, which was a solid hit. It finished 11th for the year, just missed the top 10, but it was still way behind the juggernauts like E.T. that were dominating that year. The verdict wasn't just a financial success, it got 5 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. Paul Newman gave one of those performances that reminds you why he was Paul Newman. The writing and acting in that movie are just brilliant, and it still holds up today if you watch it. But because it came out in the same year as E.T., because it didn't crack the top 10, because it was this serious courtroom drama in a decade dominated by blockbusters and comedies, it kind of faded into the background. $50 million, 5 Oscar nominations, one of Paul Newman's best performances, and most people under 50 have never heard of it. 1983 was a weird year for James Bond. There were 2 Bond movies in theaters at the same time competing against each other, and one of them wasn't even official. Sean Connery had walked away from Bond years earlier. He was done with it. But then this producer got the rights to remake Thunderball completely outside of the normal Bond studio system and convinced Connery to come back one more time. They called it Never Say Never Again, which was basically Connery making fun of himself for saying he'd never play Bond again. The problem was that the official Bond studio, Eon Productions, already had their own movie coming out that same year. It was Octopussy with Roger Moore. So suddenly you had 2 different James Bonds in theaters at the same time, and the media started calling it the Battle of the Bonds. Octopussy finished in the top 10 for the year. Never Say Never Again didn't quite make it, but it still made $160 million. That's a massive hit by any standard, except nobody remembers it. It's ranked among the worst Bond films, and because it wasn't an official Eon production, it doesn't count as canon. So it just exists in this weird place, a Sean Connery Bond movie that made a fortune but doesn't really count as part of the franchise. It's like if someone made a really successful Spider-Man movie but Marvel said it doesn't exist in the MCU. People would watch it, it would make money, and then everyone would just kind of forget about it because it doesn't fit into the official story. That's what happened to Never Say Never Again. In 1984, Clint Eastwood made a movie about a cop hunting a serial killer who's targeting sex workers. It was darker than his usual stuff, more disturbing. The movie was called Tightrope, and it made $48 million. Now, that doesn't sound like huge money compared to Never Say Never Again, but here's what makes it impressive. Tightrope finished 13th at the box office for the entire year, and it made all of that money domestically. Didn't play overseas at all, just made $48 million in the United States. The movie worked because Eastwood was a guaranteed draw. People showed up to see him no matter what he was doing, and Tightrope gave them something different from his usual cop movies. It wasn't Dirty Harry, it was bleaker and more unflinching about the violence. But then it just disappeared. Eastwood made so many better thrillers over his career that Tightrope got buried under all of them, even though it was a legitimate hit back in 1984. Harrison Ford in 1985 was already a box office machine. He'd done Star Wars, he'd done Indiana Jones. Anything he touched turned to gold. So when he signed on to play a detective who has to hide out in an Amish community, people went to see it. Witness made $65 million, though some sources claim it was over $100 million. Either way, it finished in the top 10 for 1985. Almost made it into the top 5, but 1985 was absolutely stacked. There were 3 movies that year that made over $150 million each. The movie itself is actually really good. Ford plays a tough detective who has to protect a young Amish boy who witnessed a murder, and he ends up living with the Amish and clashing with their whole way of life. It's part thriller, part culture clash, and Ford's great in it. The Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams were comedy gods in the 80s. They made Airplane, they made Top Secret, they had this perfect track record of absurd, hilarious movies that people watched over and over. Then in 1986, they made Ruthless People, and it was nothing like their other stuff. The plot's about a couple who kidnap a guy's wife, except when they call to demand ransom, they find out the husband actually wants her dead. He's relieved she's gone. The whole thing is a dark, cynical black comedy where basically everyone's terrible and nobody gets what they want. It made $70 million, 8th highest grossing film of 1986. Reviews were great across the board, but nobody talks about it now because it's just too bleak. The Zucker-Abrahams movies people remember are the ones you can watch again and again. Airplane, Naked Gun, that kind of thing. Ruthless People is funny, but it's the kind of funny that makes you feel a little uncomfortable. You watch it once, you appreciate it, and then you move on. In 1987, Michael J. Fox was one of the biggest stars on the planet. Back to the Future had come out 2 years earlier and made him untouchable. Anything with his name on it was going to print money. So he made The Secret of My Success, where he plays a guy who gets a mailroom job at a corporation but cons his way into pretending he's an executive at the same company. He's running between floors, changing clothes, and living a double life while trying to climb the corporate ladder. It should have been a great setup, but the script didn't know what to do with it. The jokes fell flat, the story went nowhere interesting with the premise. Critics weren't impressed, but Michael J. Fox was so massive at that moment that people showed up anyway. The movie made over $110 million. It was competing against Lethal Weapon and still pulled those numbers. Now this one's different because A Fish Called Wanda is actually great. John Cleese, Kevin Kline, and Jamie Lee Curtis in a heist comedy. A bunch of criminals team up to steal diamonds and immediately start double-crossing each other because they're all idiots. Kevin Kline won an Oscar for it. The movie's hilarious, people who've seen it love it, and it still holds up today. It made over $60 million, which in 1988 almost got it into the top 10 for the year. That was a year when 5 movies broke $100 million, so the box office was exploding and A Fish Called Wanda grabbed its share. Ridley Scott directed a neo-noir thriller starring Michael Douglas as a New York cop who has to escort a criminal back to Japan. Naturally, he gets pulled into the local mafia underworld. Black Rain had style, it had atmosphere, it had all the pieces of a great film. But it was also kind of a mess. The plot didn't quite work, the pacing was off, there were flaws that even Scott's visual flair couldn't cover up. Domestic audiences noticed. The movie struggled in the US, people just weren't that into it. but internationally it absolutely killed. Black Rain made over $130 million worldwide, with the majority of that coming from overseas markets. Japan especially loved it, which makes sense given the subject matter. So it's this weird case of a movie that American audiences largely rejected, but still became a blockbuster because the rest of the world showed up. It's got cult classic status now, but at the time it was just this expensive Ridley Scott movie that underperformed domestically and got saved by international box office. $130 million, and most people in the US have no idea it exists.